about that. Like who are the people who believe in this that are just like so much smarter than me or have spent so much time thinking about this? And I started and so I started playing what Peter Elbow calls the believing game, right? And the believing game is when you lean into an idea that you don't necessarily agree with to test and think about why people think it's valid, why they find it so persuasive, right? And if you've read the blog post, or if you're familiar with Peter Elbow's work, you know that he contrasts it with a game that we're already very familiar with, right? Which is the doubting game. And you have many examples of playing the doubting game. You've been playing the doubting game your entire life. In our society, the doubting game is actually what institutions teach you to do. We call it critical thinking, right? And it's basically the way that we are trained to approach text. We approach text and we pick them apart and we look for all the flaws and inconsistencies and all of the contradictions and all of the things that the author is not doing very well, right? And then we type it all up into a nice 5-paragraph essay and we submit it to our teacher. And that's kind of the institutional model, right? Is the doubting game, right? And that's what they teach us how to play in humanities classes. Right. And the believing game is completely the opposite of that, right? It's really taking these ideas that you would normally consider ridiculous or offensive and really trying to understand them from the inside, understand them on their own terms, right? And there are a couple questions that I always sort of ask myself when I'm trying to play the believing game, right? And one thing I'm always asking myself is like, what is it about this that makes it so persuasive to the people who do believe in it, right? And what would they have to give up about themselves in order to change their position? Right. And this second question is really, really important because we all have these things that we would not change. Right. We all have these lines in the sand that we draw for ourselves. Nothing, no amount of evidence, no amount of, you know, facts or whatever you want to say, nothing's going to change my mind on that. Right. So we're really kind of thinking about, what are the stakes for these folks? Right. So if folks do believe this idea that I find offensive, or they do believe this idea that I find ridiculous or stupid, right? Why? What are the stakes for them? Right? Why is it so intensely personal to them that they have to cling to it against all odds or against all evidence, right? So that's like a very useful way of kind of thinking about it, right? So I'm kind of asking myself that question. I'm also asking myself a question that I kind of started off with, right? Which is like, was there a time in my life where I would have been really attracted to this, right? A time in my life when I was like less experienced or knew a little bit less, when this would have really appealed to me, right? And what is it? What are its strengths as a text or as a philosophy or as an ideology? What does it do for the people, right? In terms of their everyday life, right? How does it function as a tool that allows them to navigate that, right? So that would be another kind of question, right? So if we're kind of thinking back to the example that I started with, the example of religion, Catholicism, I started playing the believing game, right? I started asking these questions to myself, right? What is it about Christianity that makes it so appealing to people? Why do people need it? Why do people cling to it, right? Even when they're confronted with evidence that God doesn't exist, or they're confronted with the logical contradictions that are present in the Bible, when they're confronted with evidence that, like for example, the Gospels weren't written by the 4 people that they're named after, right? Like those kinds of things. Like, what is it about this narrative or this story or this ideology that like draws people in and really like, right? But to really answer that question, you have to understand it from the inside, right? Which means you have to spend some time reading the text, right? So the first thing, I had to do, right, as I'm playing the believing game with myself is sit down and read the Bible cover to cover, right? And that's not something that a lot of people, I think, have done. A lot of atheists have done, right? And even me, someone who went to Catholic school, right? I never did that, right? We were exposed to it in pieces, right? We got chunks of it. We returned to parts of it over and over and over again. Never sat down and read it cover to cover, right? Never sat down and approached it with like a scholarly kind of impartial, objective, academic lens, right? So I did that, right? And then I started reading scholarship around the Bible. I started reading about the historical context around the Bible and things that had always really upset me, right? And just seemed like such obvious, like dumb things suddenly started to make like way more sense, right? So I don't know how familiar you are all with like biblical scholarship or the Torah, but in what Christians call the the Old Testament, there's actually 2 creation stories, right? The Bible starts with 2 creation stories, right? They're right, there's one, and then right after it, there's a completely separate one, right? And they're different, right? And if you look at them and you read them alongside one another, there's obvious contradictions, right? If you do kind of a side-by-side comparative analysis. That always bothered me, right? I was always like, how your narrative isn't even consistent, right? How could you take this seriously, right? It literally opens with a contradiction on the first page, right? Or within the first couple chapters, right? So I'm reading more historical scholarship around the Bible, and I start to learn that the Bible is actually a collection of texts that was assembled over time by a group of people in exile, right? And they included conflicting stories because they were attempting to create an archive of texts that this community in exile could rely on to sustain their religious faith, right? And so it was as much the purpose of the document was as much about collecting and preserving as it was instructing, right? In a world where you're trying to collect all of the different narratives of an oral tradition, there's bound to be some contradictions, and putting them in conversation with each other, putting them right next to each other is a strategic decision, right? That the editor of the anthology can use to highlight the differences between those stories, right? And that's a line of kind of like, again, I'm not an expert on biblical scholarship. I don't want to like sit here and claim that I am like an authority on the Old Testament or anything like that. I'm talking about my own process of scholarship and my own kind of process of personal discovery. So some of this stuff, if y'all know more about it than I do, I mean, that's phenomenal, right? Like this is still something that I'm learning about. I'm still in the process of playing the believing game, right? But as I'm learning more about the context and the cultural kind of background and the history around this text and the reason why some of these kind of contradictions are appearing and why the text is structured the way it is, right? The needle starts to shift, right? So I wouldn't say that I am like a believer or a Christian. I'm not going to say that at all, right? But I can't be as confident as I was about my atheism, right? Because there are millions of people around the world who do take this seriously, and statistically, some of them are bound to be much, much smarter than I am and know much, much more about it. Just if it's a numbers game, right? If we're just playing the numbers game, statistically, that like, right? So, so I do have to take it seriously. I do have to engage it, right? I do have to kind of think about how I can move from this position of criticism, right, where I'm just kind of dumping on the Bible, right? I haven't really engaged it fully. I haven't really thought about the reason why it's structured the way it is, or any of the kinds of concerns that went into creating it as a text, right? I'm moving from that position of criticism into a position of critique, right? To kind of think about, how are these concepts deployed, right? Is it Christianity that's the problem, or is it the way that Christianity is taken up by certain groups of people in specific times? Right? Which one is the real problem, right? And as I'm moving from criticism to critique, I'm developing a much more nuanced and richer picture of this interaction between different cultural groups, right? It had never occurred to me in my critique of Christianity, like my criticism of Christianity, my early kind of reactionary, right? That these were also texts that other religions were using, right? Because of my narrow kind of Christian-centered worldview, right? Like it never occurred to me, like, what would it be like to approach this this text from the lens of a different religion, right? And does it change, right? So that kind of comparing and contrasting just wasn't part of the criticism, right? Because I'd already made up my mind. I'd already decided what I believed, right? And everything, once I'd made up my mind, once I'd already decided what I believed, everything that I encountered just became either something I dismissed or it was something I enlisted into my pre-existing interpretation, my pre-existing worldview, right? And it wasn't until I started playing the believing game that I was able to kind of develop this more robust critique, right? And think about how Christianity is deployed and what it means for various groups of people.